Now to Russia's war in Ukraine and U.S. relations with China. We're living in a time of heightened political instability, and according to the Eurasia Group's top risks for 2025 forecast, President Trump's policies could add fuel to the fire. Ian Bremmer is the president and founder of the Eurasia Group, a global political risk research and consulting firm, and he joins Walter Isaacson to discuss the potential dangers that lie ahead.
Thank you, Paula and Ian Bremmer. Welcome back to the show.
Good to see you, Walter.
Every year, your company, the Eurasia Group, has a global risk assessment. And this time you say we are heading back to the law of the jungle. What do you mean by that?
I think it's the most dangerous period geopolitically since either the 30s, before World War II, or the early Cold War, before the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a world where the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. And the United States is both in an incredibly strong position compared to its adversaries, China, massive economic challenges, worse since the 90s, maybe the 70s, Russia in deep decline, Iran having lost their empire of proxies in the region. But also the U.S. is much stronger politically, economically, technologically, and militarily than all of its allies. And that's certainly true compared to where Trump's U.S. was in 2017. So the fact that that power imbalance exists at a time when the United States is saying, we don't want to promote collective security, we don't want to promote global architecture for free trade, we don't want to promote rule of law or export democracy. No, we want to rip up our own global order, which is not something that we've seen in history, and instead get countries to cut deals with us transactionally. We don't care what their political or economic systems are, but they better listen to us because otherwise there will be hell to pay. That structurally is the geopolitical dynamic that is driving so much of the uncertainty in the world for the coming year.
Well, you say that the Trump administration is talking about tearing up the global order that America has led, especially a global order based on free trade. But isn't there a backlash both in the United States and in the Western world against the free trade global order that left so many people out?
Absolutely. Trump isn't the lead risk here. Trump is the lead symptom of something that's been coming for decades, Walter. The fact is that the average American, Democrat, Republican, or independent, leans either way, doesn't believe that free trade benefits them, doesn't believe that the U.S. providing military security and, by the way, fighting wars all over the world benefits them, and doesn't really believe that the United States is a representative democracy, so certainly isn't interested in trying to export that model all over the world. So yes, that is absolutely true that the Americans don't support these things. And it's also true that Trump has increasingly a lot of like-minded people among allies, some of whom have elected their own anti-establishment folks into office. Think about Javier Milei in Argentina. Think about Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. Heck, think about Giorgia Meloni in Italy. And even in countries that really, really oppose what Trump is standing for, you still have large percentages of their populations that are sympathetic. And Elon Musk saying that, the AfD in Germany, the Alternatives for Deutschland, are the only way to save the country. And he's doing that, with full support of Trump. Or that, the King of England has to step in so that the British Prime Minister has to step down. That is a message that resonates with minority parts of those populations, but growing parts of those populations, Walter.
You've talked about the risks of Trump coming into office, and the Democrats have said that he's a risk to democracy itself. Do you believe there's an imminent risk to democracy because of the Trump administration?
No, I think it's overstated. And anyone that's watched the way that Biden has comported himself in engaging with Trump, as well as his entire administration over the past transition period, would know that there was a lot of exaggeration that the Democrats were using with an imminent concern that democracy was going to fail. I don't believe that Trump is committed to rule of law or democracy. In fact, in many ways, I think he finds it inimical to some of what he would like to accomplish as not having checks and balances as a president and as a person. But that is very different from what the American system would allow Trump to do. The fact is that the judiciary in the U.S. may well be politically appointed, but still acts largely independently. The fact is that the military is still a professional military. And perhaps most important, the U.S. is a federal system. And so many rules, including how elections are actually run, are not run at the federal system at the discretion of the presidency. They're run by local state administrations, red and blue, that are pretty well run. So, all of that implies that the United States is not at the brink of dictatorship, but a Trump who is willing to act in a maximally transactional way and who feels like his political adversaries have used parts of the American government to go after him, whether it's impeachments that he believes are inappropriate, or efforts to investigate him or put him in jail, or even not getting enough Secret Service support around him, and he almost was killed by an assassination attempt. That does imply that he is going to be more willing than one would be comfortable with to use the power ministries in the U.S., the FBI, the Department of Justice, the IRS, others, to go after his enemies, to politicize them, to weaponize them, because he believes they've been politicized and weaponized against him. And certainly Kash Patel, who has been one of the most controversial appointments and has had a rough ride in his private meetings with Republican senators because he hasn't been able to adequately describe what he would do as FBI director, what his vision is for the FBI. But he's been very clear about who his enemies are, his list of enemies that he would want to go after if he became FBI director. And I believe that that has the potential to have a chilling effect on how people are willing to comport themselves publicly. And I think, that when you see someone like Mark Zuckerberg do a 180 in so many different ways after Trump and Elon by connection win, I think you're going to see a lot more of that among political and economic elites in the United States.
Trump has a sort of view of the world that he can get along with people, that somehow or another, even as strong as even North Korea or whatever, he can do personal diplomacy. Do you think there's a possibility of an actual breakthrough and a more of an accord between the U.S. and China?
With Trump, never say never. I mean, Trump is going to engage with Putin directly. And since the invasion started in 2022, Biden and Putin haven't spoken. So, I mean, clearly there's a willingness to engage. You mentioned that with the North Koreans. Even Iran, I mean, I think Trump is going to put very tough sanctions on Iran, much tougher than under Biden. But I think there's going to be a willingness to hear out an Iranian offer under duress in Tehran that might be much more significant than the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So never say never. But let's also remember, Walter, that for all of the criticism of Trump being in Putin's pocket, the reality of Trump's first term is that U.S. policy towards Russia was significantly more hawkish than under Obama. I mean, it was Trump that gave the Ukrainians the anti-tank Javelin missiles. Obama refused. He thought it was going to lead to too much risk. It was Trump that added to the Obama sanctions. So the fact that Trump is willing to talk does not mean that you get to a deal. And I believe that Trump will engage with Xi Jinping. I think it's possible that Elon Musk will engage with Xi Jinping. Wouldn't be the first time he's met him, and Trump is happy to bring Elon into top relationships. We've already seen that over the past weeks. Elon has a lot of exposure to China. But ultimately, I think the strong desire to contain China among all of Trump's key national security advisors and among all of the Republicans in Congress make this too hard. I think the demands on China make this too hard. The desire of the Americans to use tariffs as a principal element of economic and national security policy make this too hard. So what I'm saying is that the bet that you would make this year is that U.S.-China relations get a lot worse.
So we've seen, it seems, a breakthrough in Gaza. Do you think that President Trump is positioned to do something significant in the Middle East, given the weakening of Iran, his relationships with the Gulf states, and the changes that are now happening with Israel and the Palestinians?
Look, before October 7th, Israel was clearly the dominant military power in the region. And it turns out that Israel is still the dominant military power in the region. They are the ones that can determine, both escalation and de-escalation on their timetable and according to their preferences. And they are that dominant in large part because the United States provides an immense amount of direct military aid, technological support, intelligence support, et cetera, though the Israelis have built out great autonomous capabilities. Trump's best relationships in the world still are with the Israeli government and with the Gulf states. That was his first trip as president last time around. You remember, he goes to Israel, he grabs the orb, with the Saudis and all the Gulf states. That is still true. It's a lot of economic engagement, a lot of political engagement, a lot of support for him. They were all very happy to see Trump win. So he's going to be very comfortable with the fact that the Israelis and the Gulf states are on top right now and that the Iranians are in serious trouble, having lost almost all of their allies and all the people they support. I mean, Hezbollah, six months ago, Hezbollah was the most powerful non-state military actor in the world. And they've been functionally destroyed. And the Iranians can't even get them more military support because the transit route was Assad's Syria, and he's gone now too, after a 2-week revolution that surprised everybody, right? So, yeah, I think that Trump is in the driver's seat on the Middle East. One big question will be what he decides to do with that position vis-a-vis America's top adversary, Iran. Is he just going to squeeze them with more sanctions, preventing them from exporting a lot of oil through the unflagged tankers, which he can do, and it's going to hurt China, it's going to hurt others? Or might he consider direct military strikes, even against their nuclear capabilities, which the Israeli prime minister would sorely like him to do? I suspect it will be the former, not the latter, at least in the opening months, because I don't think Trump wants to risk $100 plus oil, and I don't think he wants to risk a broader war that he, played a role in starting. But it's absolutely plausible, especially if the Iranians don't respond well to the greater pressure they're going to be facing from the U.S. and from Israel.
Iran's on the ropes, as you say, and I think Secretary of State Blinken said in some ways they might just be able to have just a 2-week breakout period before they could create more enhanced nuclear capabilities. Do you think Iran is now going to do that because it's on the ropes?
There's a very big difference between that and an operational nuclear bomb. All of the experts say it's 6 months minimum to that, and probably a year before you could actually have that bomb with some form of delivery system attached to it. And the period in which they would be making an effort towards that breakout would be very clear, both to the international inspectors and, of course, to the people that could stop them. So I think that the Iranian government would be very, very hard-pressed to take on that kind of a direct risk to their own regime, because if anything were going to incentivize the Israelis and the Americans to try to take that regime out, it would be that behavior.
What about Ukraine? Do you think now that there's going to have to be a settlement or ceasefire in place, or is there some other way this can be resolved?
I think a ceasefire is very likely. Trump certainly very strongly wants one. And the European allies in NATO mostly recognize that's where we need to go, because the Ukrainians just don't have the capacity to continue to fight and to continue to raise the young men that they have over the course of the last 3 years. And by the way, not so young men in Ukraine doing a lot of the fighting right now. So, yeah, there's going to be a push. But it's a lot easier to get the Ukrainians to negotiate right now than it is the Russians. I thought that one of Trump's posts in the past few weeks, very interesting, that he said maybe the Chinese can help on Ukraine specifically, because he understands that he does not have the personal leverage with Putin that the Chinese do. And so, look, the idea that Trump is going to be in Putin's pocket, I think, is a myth perpetuated by his opponents. He does want to end the war. And I think that that willingness to end the war will include Ukraine recognizing that they're not going to get a significant component of the land that Russia occupies back. They're going to be de facto partitioned. But Russia is going to have to accept continued security guarantees for Ukraine. They're going to have to accept that, the rest of Ukraine is sovereign and is aligned by and armed by the West. And that's not going to be easy for Putin to accept. A temporary ceasefire, sure. We've got 42-day ceasefire with Gaza. But will that really end the fighting long term? Will it really end the war, the proxy war that Russia is now fighting essentially with NATO? And there, I think the answer is no. That's a much bigger long-term concern.
You say that Trump says that maybe China can help on the Ukraine situation. Is that a good thing? Do we want China to help there and even help in the Middle East?
I think what we don't want is for the Chinese to be pushed into a corner where they feel like they have no choice but to ally with some of the worst chaos actors in the world, Russia, Iran, North Korea. The Chinese ultimately, they've done a lot with Russia we don't like, right? I mean, they've engaged in a lot of dual-use technology export. That's a problem. They've supported the Russians much more on the global stage. But the Chinese ultimately want stability. They want an end to the war. They also want better relations with their trade partners, including the Europeans, who are much more willing to decouple from them, especially the frontline Europeans that need the Chinese capital the most. The Polish government, for example, the Romanians, because the Chinese have been supportive of Russia on the Ukraine war. So I think that Trump is correct to say we should be looking to engage with the Chinese to try to push them in favor of stability.
You always put out the global risk report this time of year, but let me ask you a more optimistic question. What's a bright spot that you see? What is global opportunity that's surprising to you?
Well, one is that Trump is going to get a lot of wins because he is actually very powerful, both domestically and globally, and that will address some issues that need to be addressed. Like, for example, illegal immigration in the United States. It's been broken. It'll be less broken. You might not necessarily agree on every tool he's going to use to address it, but everyone agrees it's broken. That's one of the reasons he was elected. And finally, Walter, there are so many things that are so exciting. When I look at what you can do with AI, when I look at scale, just how much we're getting out of new energy and infrastructure, whether it's electric vehicles or solar or wind, all of that to me at a global level is very, very exciting for our kids and for our grandchildren. So it's still the most extraordinary time to be here. It's just there is a lot of China that's going to be broken, both literally and figuratively, as we're making our way through it.
Ian Bremmer, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.